NBC is reporting that Democratic Congressman Vicente Gonzalez paid a Texas blogger to attack his Republican opponent, new GOP Congresswoman Mayra Flores, with racist name calling, including the name Miss Frijoles 21 times and calling her a cotton-picking liar. Flores took the insults in stride, saying, quote, "I love frijoles and I grew up eating frijoles. I'm not embarrassed in my upbringing. Here's to Miss Frijoles 2022.
The attacks on Flores prompted a wave of denunciations by fellow Democrats.
It's Republicans who are courting Hispanic voters after Democrats failed to invest and reach out to Latinos. Rafael also reports that the National Republican Congressional Committee says it's recruited 102 Hispanic candidates in this cycle. Hill reporter Rafael Bernal joins us now to discuss. Welcome back, Rafael.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. What is the situation, first of all, with this blogger who was paid to go after Flores, or he was paid and he also went after Flores? Do you know if he was paid specifically to say these things? I think the candidate himself has probably denounced them by now. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I reached out to a representative from Flores, heard from her basically the same response she's been giving, that the blogger's statements are sexist and racist, and I think we can all agree that the blogger's statements are pretty terrible. But I also talked to Vicente Gonzalez, and he disputes the way this has been reported. He says his campaign did pay for campaign ads, about $1,000, on this very popular blog in South Texas. And, he has now denounced what this McHale character has said, the way he said it. And he pledged to me, he did tell me, he pledged he will never again advertise on that McHale report, which does mean there is at least agreement that McHale crossed a line between the two candidates.
And if you're calling her that, I don't know what the strategy there is. Is it to get more, white voters or more racist voters or something? It doesn't seem like a term of, well, especially in how she embraced the actual idea of frijoles, even though calling her that was dumb. It's not like that's going to turn off Latino. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, it is a callback to a racial slur used against Mexican Americans that we're not going to repeat here. But also, investigating who McHale is, he's a Democratic blogger. He supports Democrats in South Texas. He's a longtime member of the community. He was apparently a high school coach for a number of decades, and he's very embedded in the Latino community. He's always had this sort of this style, this very aggressive, a little bit edgy style, but it seems that's caught up to him. Really, I mean, it's kind of a reflection of how hardcore politics are in the Rio Grande Valley, where candidates do usually go after each other really aggressively. It's historically been in Democratic primaries where that happens, because Democrats have been winning many elections, or most important elections in that region, for a very long time. But Republicans have made gains. Let's remember the mayor of McAllen is now a Republican, for instance. And Flores herself, although she won a special election with really low participation, you have a Republican representing a Rio Grande Valley district. So I think what's happening is that tough rhetoric, that sort of almost unacceptable rhetoric from the Democratic primaries and how Democratic politics takes place historically there, is bleeding into the general election. And now we all get to see, how the sausage is made, and it's not pretty.
Yeah, and my guess on this, and tell me if you think this is right, is that because this so often played out in Democratic primaries and often played out in Spanish, that the kind of national media just never picked up on it, because they'd have to be alerted by somebody in that Democratic primary of it happening, because they're not embedded, they're not following these races very closely, and there weren't a ton of Democratic congressional primaries. It's probably a lot, we're talking about lower seats for the most part. Whereas now you have Republicans who are running competitive races against Democrats. They see that and they're like, oh, the national press is going to eat this up. That's my guess about how this becomes a national story. Is that about right, or what's your read on why it stayed under the radar, the national media's radar, until Flores was able to make this a national story?
I think that's absolutely right. There is, bipartisanship breeds attention to a certain extent, but there's also, well, we haven't been paying enough attention to Latino politics. California maybe since the 1990s, which for the size of California's Latino population is kind of crazy. But also Latinos in California weren't engaged politically before the 1990s. Texas is sort of going a similar process. Florida was the exception, but Florida Latino politics are very different from the rest of the country. And there were, districts here and there, a district in New York, a district in Chicago. Now it's going to be 2 districts in Chicago. But Latino politics with Latino demographics and Latino engagement is growing. And we're just paying more attention because politicians are, paying a little bit more attention and investing a little bit more in the community.
Okay, so help me understand this because I'm lost, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers are lost about this as well. But Vicente Gonzalez sounds like a Hispanic name. I'm trying to understand this. So he pays a blogger. The blogger, who's a Democrat, uses racist slurs towards Mayra Flores. But I mean, aren't they this? I mean, how is this working? I'm really
Kim, are you saying he's a Mr. Frijoles? So what is it? How is it a distinguishing thing to say?
Why he would use or pay somebody to use slurs that are, especially if they're within the Hispanic community. You're saying that they're in this area. So the audience that he's even writing to, they're Hispanic and. So I'm having a hard time understanding what is the dynamic here.
I want to hear Rafael's answer to this, but basically my understanding, he was just taking out ads on the blog, and he got caught up then and blamed for the rhetoric. What's Rafael? What's your sense? Yeah, because what on earth is he thinking is a good question.
That is absolutely correct. So what he says, he disputes the way the story was reported as. It was reported as him paying somebody to say these things. And he disputes that entirely. He says, this is a very popular blog in the region. I paid $1,000 to have my ad on there. Perfectly normal for any candidate. And then he said these things. The blogger said these things. So Vicente Gonzalez pulled the ads and vowed never to pay for ads on that blog again. That's one side of it. The other side of it is, yes, Vicente Gonzalez is Mexican-American. Mayra Flores is also Mexican-American, although she was born in Mexico. She is the first Mexico-born woman elected to Congress in history. So they're both, let's say, ethnically, if not the same, very similar. They're from the same region. They have similar origins. What you're getting to is a lot of nuance in how Hispanics view themselves and how Hispanics treat each other. There is, there's for all the beauty that there is in, let's stick with specifically Mexican American culture and Mexican culture, there is a lot of internal racism. There is a lot of, a lot of leftovers from a colonial period that never really ended in Mexico, and then from borders crossing families and families crossing borders, there are sort of self-hating attacks that happen a lot within Hispanic communities, and they debilitate the community. They're terrible, but it is part of the culture. It's a darker part of the culture. Does that excuse, for however embedded McHale might be in the Hispanic community in that region, does that excuse that kind of language on a political blog? I mean, I would argue no. I'm sure Mr. McHale has a different idea.
And what do you make of these, these attempts to portray? There was one in the New York Times. They're really in the mainstream media and some Democratic forces trying to portray Flores and others as this far right labeling that I think is kind of clumsy, and maybe she has some views or has said some things in the past that you could describe, or some tweets that you could describe as as fringe or something, but that a lot of the views she's representing really aren't outside of what a large community of actually Latino voters want, and that how the Democratic Party has missed that now Republicans are capturing a larger, or are prepared to capture a larger and larger share of this group, based on interest in social conservative values, contempt for socialism, that this group isn't necessarily thinking of immigration and more immigration as some top issue. Talk to us a little bit about that before we let you go.
Well, I certainly wouldn't have pitched headlines saying the far-right Latinas, but the New York Times did, and successfully. But to be fair, they're not calling her far-right because of her mantra, and she's stuck to it. She answers almost everything with the phrase God, family, and country. That's not far-right in any description among Latinos, among white people, anywhere in the world. It's just not far-right. They are calling her far right because she's engaged in election denial. She's engaged in some QAnon associated banter. Right. That is, in anywhere in the world, that is far right. Does it matter that she's Latina to engage in election denial? No, it doesn't matter. That's why I think it's unfortunate to tie those two terms together.
Well, Rafael, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure being here.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.